Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of that we need in the West, mass migration, because there's such a shortage, such an incredible, chronic shortage of workers. Not only is there a shortage in workers today, but as the white people aren't procreating as much, given they're all being told that they're evil Nazis, is hardly surprising. They're not procreating as much as they used to. So the argument is that in the future, in fact, forever into the future, as far as the eye can see, mass migration, but only of black and brown illiterate peasants, by the way, have to come into the Western world. And Australia is one of the countries in the Western orbit. So, and recently, Senator Chuck Schumer of New York was waxing lyrical about, there's such a shortage, we just got to have these people. We got to have them. So where are these jobs? Now, that argument of we got to have mass migration because there's such a worker shortage and such a skills shortage, alleged, again, all WEF, globalist propaganda, none of it's, not a word of it's true, but this is the line that they push. So, we need this mass migration. Now, in Australia, the mass migration things kicked off. I mean, it's now over 25 years since the supposed alarm bells are, where there is a skills. The economy just cannot grow. The Australian economy just cannot grow, not even by 1 cent, without the skills of illiterate peasants from the third world. Now, what skills they bring to the table is it's difficult to imagine, but that was the propaganda line, and really it just opened the door to millions of again illiterate third world peasants. So when anywhere in the world where there's or around the wider Asian region in Australia's case, so the Indian subcontinent in particular, so wherever there's a surplus population, India, Pakistan, and so on, then masses of people are brought in to Australia, and this is supposed to be fixing a supposed problem. Now, the problem doesn't exist. The problem is all invented. It's a complete invention, a complete fabrication. And even if there was a shortage of skills or workers, you wouldn't bring in illiterate peasants. Now, no matter where you look, and recently there was another paper or study done in Australia where the government has, in a very roundabout, very careful way, admitted that the mass migration hasn't solved anything, and that the majority of people coming in are actually not a net economic benefit to the. Now they say, well, that's not a problem. We intended, it was our intention to solve problems. Okay, so it didn't work out. Who cares? But what we now need is a strategic plan. That'll fix everything. And so they're slightly pivoting away and say, a bit of fine tuning, not a problem. So I'm not talking about having fewer numbers or having a much heavier reliance on skills and things like that. No. They're just saying a little bit of fine tuning and it'll all be good. So now it's been openly admitted, secretly, really covertly, there was a government report that was quite clear about it a few years ago. And it said that the mass migration there's less than 5% of the mass migrants coming in are economically viable, even within their lifetimes. And if you want sort of people who hit the ground as economically viable, 2 or 3%. In Britain, it's the same, 1, 2, 3%, and the same, of course, in the United States and Canada and elsewhere. So a very small proportion of the people that come in are actually economically viable. Now, this idea that there's a shortage of workers, there's no shortage of workers. There's a shortage of workers that are prepared to or able economically to work for peasant wages. And there's also been a shortage in investment in, say, education in areas like trades and the like. But even there, apprentice tradespeople used to begin at 14 or 15. Now the average age that people are starting apprenticeships is 18 or 19, and an 18 or 19-year-old has generally different economic horizons than a 14-year-old. So the idea was with an apprenticeship that kids would start an apprenticeship, and by the time they finished their apprenticeship, they'd be 18 or 19, and then they would be sort of independent adults. But of course, that's quite quite different now. So there's been a failure to invest in education in various areas such as trade. So, but nonetheless, is there a worker shortage? There's a shortage of people being paid enough money to want the job. There's definite issues there. But is there a shortage of workers? Well, no. If you look at the amount of people in Australia or any Western country that are underemployed, that is people that are for example, who are working 10 hours a week, but they want to work 40 hours a week, or people who have skills and capabilities and credentials as a rocket scientist, but they've instead got a job sweeping floors or something like that. So underemployment is a huge issue across the West. Similarly, people in their 60s are underemployed, seriously underemployed. So there's a lot of particularly sort of fit people, say in their mid to late 60s or even into their 70s for that matter. So there's a real issue with underemployed people, ready and able and willing to do work, but there's either no work for them, or there's a preference to hire black lesbians rather than older white guys, for example. So there's a huge underemployment issue, but there's also a large unemployment issue that's hidden in areas like disability pensions and things of that nature. So there's a large cohort of people that can't really, that may be unable to make decent money or get into decent paying jobs, but they're unable to, they don't want those jobs necessarily, so they go on to a pension instead. So there's various areas that could be addressed there. But just outside of that, the unemployment rate is quite high in the West. So there are millions of unemployed people who could work, but either there's no incentives for them to work, and similarly the system of unemployment benefits cuts off as soon as someone gets a job, and it can take 6 to 8 weeks to get back onto these benefits. So to take a casual or uncertain job as a labourer, where you might get laid off in a couple of days, because it's raining or this or that or whatever, for any reason. They're very, very unstable, uncertain jobs, and rosters that can where you have to really be on standby. So if you accept hours there, you lose your unemployment benefit for 6 to 8 weeks. Whereas if you go and get a full-time steady job, that's different. So there's a vast area of employment in short-term casual type employment, and where there are no really worker safeguards, and the welfare system in terms of unemployment benefits hasn't really caught up and worked out how to work in tandem with these uncertain casual employment jobs. And there's certainly an increase in those jobs, particularly as worker benefits have declined substantially. So let's have a look. But there's something bigger than this, I think, going on. Where is the growth in jobs? So if we look at and this struck me sort of particularly, and I've thought about it before and mentioned it before, but struck me particularly when I went into the city, downtown Sydney recently, where and this is in sort of the peak hour, as the office workers are sort of coming to work, was the amount of people. White people were a minority, a very decided minority everywhere in downtown Sydney, and that took me completely by surprise. Not that there weren't a lot of non-white people, but it was the number of them compared to whites took me by surprise. And now again, you're sort of talking to a guy here, or where I've done a vast amount of international travel all over the world doing business. So I'm unfazed by these sort of things. I'm used to being the only white guy in the hotel or the restaurant or the office. I don't think twice about it. But when it's sort of in my home city, then it is it is rather confronting. But so where are the jobs of the future coming from? These people, they're walking around in groups. They're all chattering away in their own language. If you go to any sort of takeout food, store where there's a lot of them employed, then their English is so bad that you have to really sort of be patient with them so they can get it. So they're only recent arrivals, or they live in their ethnic communes and don't speak English at all. And given that they have to deal with people speaking English, in the work that they're doing, one suspects, given how poor their English is, that they're only recent arrivals. So there's a huge amount of labour hire corruption and scams, and I would argue modern slavery going on with this. But the amount of them shocked me. Now, a lot of these takeout food shops are not viable. They're not viable businesses. If they had to pay proper wages and all that sort of stuff, that they wouldn't exist. They'd be out of business. So workers are being imported to work in non-viable businesses, and where the wages aren't enough for people to live any sort of independent lifestyle. When you're packing 20 Indians into a 2-bedroom apartment, they can afford to work for those sort of wages, because there's 20 of them having to share one toilet, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to have a look at this about there's supposedly masses of unfilled jobs going in the West. Australia's no different. And the propaganda is so consistent across the entire West, and you know that it's propaganda. There's no difference between circumstances and the Arctic sort of waste of Canada and the in Australia, and so there's no differences at all. The propaganda is absolutely consistent across the West. Now, there's some realities here to deal with. For example, there's a warehouse that I used to do business with the people who owned this warehouse years ago, and employed at the time about 700 people. Now that was more than 25 years ago. Now that same warehouse employs less than 100 people, but does 5 times the amount of business. 5 times the amount of stuff goes through the door there, even though the number of employees is 1/7 of what it used to be. Now, automation, robotization, all sorts of software, and which is a wider part of the automation process, and artificial intelligence coming in now, then that's how they're able to reduce the number of employees. So in the areas of mass employment, whether it be manufacturing that used to be mass employment, or warehousing like this, where people are physically running around collecting cartons of stuff and stacking them on pallets, all these sorts of things. People to put the plastic shrink wrap around the pallet, all that type. That's all done by automation now, or much of it anyway. So the demand for the mass employment type of jobs has decreased, quite substantially decreased. You look at the other things like the type of forklift type operations, how everything had to be gathered by forklift. Now that's again heavily automated, that process. Nonetheless, there's not an area of mass employment, again, high density employment, that hasn't been very substantially affected by automation and robotization and clever software and all that sort of stuff. So the demand for people in the mass employment areas is diminishing, and diminishing fast, by the way. And again, this has happened in 20, 25 years. So now, given that same warehouse can handle much larger volumes of business on much fewer staff, it means it's not like there's extra warehouses popping up everywhere and they need more people. That's not happening. So what we're on the verge of, I would argue, or certainly this possibility, and this is the sting in the tail of it all, is that we're on the threshold of where the globalists and the World Economic Forum, you'll own nothing and be happy sentiment that Klaus Schwab goes on about. We're on the verge of a complete reordering of society. And that is where the jobs will come from. And there'll be nothing jobs. There'll be bullshit jobs. There won't be productive jobs. there'll be social control type jobs. And I'll give you some examples of that. So let's suppose the government brings out an edict that says that having an oven or a stove in your house is illegal because of global warming. Global warming, climate change is going to destroy the whole planet within minutes. And the only way we can stop it, the governments that are going to be totally controlled or are totally controlled by the globalists, the government's going to say, so therefore, no one is allowed to cook food or heat up food in their own house. You're just not allowed to do it. And if you do it, you'll be thrown in prison. So all stoves have to be removed, all house heaters have to be, like a major reordering of how you live your life day to day, and the ability to come into your house and cook food or heat up something or whatever, I don't know, make coffee and all that. So that'll all be outlawed. But what would that mean if that happens? That would mean there'd need to be an absolute explosion of takeout food shops. Every corner is going to have somebody with a little cart, and then that little cart's going to be cooking, stuff, chicken on a skewer or something. It's going to be preparing or heating up food, and that's where you have to go to get your food. Now, as I used to travel when I first started traveling around the third world on business. I mean, mostly I was going to the first world, but this also incorporated third world countries, where, by the way, you've got a small nucleus of insanely rich people in these third world countries. But one of the poorest countries per capita in the world I went to has in the top 1,000 richest people in the world, they had something like 50 odd of the top 1,000 richest people in the whole world in this dirt poor basket case country where you walk across dead bodies in the street. So when I first started going to these countries, I was surprised at how many street vendors there were selling food. They're everywhere. And then I wondered how a population like that could afford. They're very cheap, these places. I never used them because the hygiene was definitely an issue there, but they're very cheap, and even the dirt poor peasants seem to be able to afford it. So I speculated and wondered on that. And I was having lunch one day at a salubrious restaurant with one of the rich sort of government crony type people, and I mentioned it and the guy I was talking to said that it was people can't afford to have stoves or ovens in the house; they're too poor. And given a lot of the houses, particularly in the outer burbs, are made of sort of wood and grass, the mud hut type gig, they're not allowed to have open flame stoves. They can't afford they don't have electricity or this or that, type of thing. There's often only one sort of central cooking stove in the whole village and this sort of thing. So people tend to eat at these in as much of lack of alternatives and the illegality of having open flames in certain districts and regions and house structures. So there's a culture and a sort of day-to-day habit where everyone just eats. Well, not everyone maybe, but certainly a vast bulk of people eat on these takeout, these little food stall So everyone's running around with these little carts, which are controlled by a sort of a mafia, a centralized mafia. Everyone has these little carts, and the peasants have to borrow money to get the cart, which it's like a franchise almost. And then they have to pay the mafia guy that owns the cart, and that again just flows money back into the pockets of the Bill Gates type people in those countries, and that's sort of how it was. Now, even in countries where they're somewhat affluent, they're not poor, they're somewhat affluent, but people live in they live in these one room places, like a small bed sit, I suppose you'd say in English type terms, but it's all in one room. The kitchen, the lounge room, the bedroom is all just one sort of area, small area, and they may have a separate toilet, shower and wash basin or something like that, but very small compact places, but there's no actual kitchen as so these people tend to eat out. You can imagine, like, say, a compact hotel room where the only thing you've got is a jug to boil water to make a cup of coffee or something like that. So even in these places, it's quite cheap to eat out, and take out food is, particularly in, say, Asia, where it's rice with a few vegetables or something, and that's the meal. Then it's quite cheap. So you probably couldn't do it a whole lot cheaper, if at all, even if you were buying from the local grocery store. Now, on a relative basis, the local grocery store, the prices there are quite high. Now, you go into other third world countries where things like rice are heavily subsidized by the government, but so you can have like a 50-pound bag of rice you can buy for $2, that type of stuff. But this idea of you don't cook or prepare food at home, or you have no facility that you control to do it, means that you eat out. Let's now say that's the case in the West, that the government says, okay, global, climate change, it's going to end the planet if you try and cook food at home. So you now have to eat out. Now, if that were the case, and there needed to be a little food cart on every street corner all over the West, then you would suddenly have an instant demand for millions of peasant workers. It's not going to be a complicated job, or something. You have a demand for millions of peasant workers. Because you've got to wonder, why are these masses of people, illiterate third world people, why are they being imported, given that the sort of work they end up doing is working in these non-viable takeout food stores that couldn't exist. I mean, the business would have to close down within minutes if they had to pay wages, as in, living Western supposedly legally mandated wages. But instead, all these places exist in this artificial delusion economy, parasite economy, where the workers are brought in from the peasants are brought into the third world, and they're given accommodation and food and a few pennies to sort of spend, but their whole salary is packaged up in tax evasion programs and tax offset programs, things like that are scams. Scams of the first order. And what else could these illiterate peasants do anyway? And they're illiterate in their own language, for goodness sakes, let alone English. So there'd be a massive demand for workers just to cook food. So just by that simple measure of saying, if you use your stove at home, or you're not allowed to, every new house won't have a stove, or these types of things, or you're not allowed to cook food unless you've got a minimum of 20 people per square meter, and that type of stuff. The government's going to impose, I would surmise, Western governments, under the control of the globalists, won't be what the people want, are going to impose these requirements, and then say, well, we have to we've now got a worker shortage. Who's going to cook the food? Oh, disaster. Everyone's going to starve. Little babies will starve. This sort of thing. And then we have to import millions of illiterate peasants to cook food on the street corner food carts. I think that's really a real possibility. But, you could look at other changes that the government could force on us. So gazillions of fast food workers needed. So what about their clothes, or the grocery store, all the chain stores? Grocery stores are closed, and the only way you can get your groceries now is through deliveries. A van or a truck comes to deliver the groceries to your door, and that's already something that's in play at the moment. Let's suppose that the grocery stores all shut down, because it's expensive to run a grocery store, the real estate. So why not put that real estate into building apartments or something like that? There's and look at the health issues. We've got a huge health issue. People could die. Little children could die. So you can't be allowed to go to the grocery store because you may pick up some terrible disease. So the government has to protect you. The government has to close down all the grocery stores, and then you only get things delivered to your home or your place of residence or whatever. So that'll mean that pretty much everything will need to be delivered, and that means there'll be a massive explosion of delivery drivers. Again, a low IQ, illiterate peasants can do it type thing job. And remember, when people are illiterate, they do straight matching. So they do things like color matching, or they look at the shape of a word. They don't know what the word means. Like they look at the shape of it, they match it to the other shape. Oh, okay, that's the same thing. I've got the right address here. That type of stuff. And especially with the geolocation stuff on pretty much all the trucks now, that can be programmed to different languages. So they can, it can be, turn left here to get to that address. The whole thing can be pre-programmed and set up. So the driver doesn't need to speak English or even understand what's going on. They just follow whatever the instructions are that has been programmed into the centrally, programmed into the system. So there would be so now we've got a massive demand for fast food, take out food workers, and we've got now a massive demand for drivers. None of these are skilled jobs. Well, what about, we've got to get rid of these older white people. So there can be special euthanasia counselors that can come to your place of residence and just help you move on to the next life and this sort of thing. And again, like other white people may balk or hesitate at it, but you come with people from the third world, they won't. You give them little scripts and send them out. So maybe there'll be an explosion of those sort of people. Again, one can't imagine these would be highly paid jobs. So if we look at how, just those examples of how society could be, and I think will be, in some form or similar form to that, restructured, and that would create this demand, this insane alleged demand for third world workers. Again, and the illiterate peasants from the surplus populations of the world. So my take on this is there is no shortage of workers. That's bullshit, absolute bullshit. And get the amount of workers needed in what we can say are traditional industries, whether it be warehouses or whatever, the amount of workers actually needed is declining, and considerably so. And on top of that, the outsourcing of jobs to places, like India, call centers, you name it. This is again, there's a very sharp reduction in the amount of jobs that need to be filled. Currently the big companies, big multinational companies that are just fronts for the globalist program, and of course the government are creating jobs out of in a very Soviet sort of communist socialist type style, are creating jobs and then affirmative action gifting them to the mass migrants, from India and places like that. I mean, these people aren't needed. So there's none of the people that are coming in under the migration scheme are needed, unless you look at the artificial socialist economy that's being created under our very noses. Only in those conditions and circumstances are they needed at all. But it's a completely artificial economy. It's not an economy that exists in a competitive capitalist marketplace at all. But I think that's where we're heading. I think that's where we're going. That there's going to be, you won't be allowed to have a motor vehicle, for example, no private transport. You won't be allowed to prepare food in your house and all these sorts of things. There won't be grocery stores to go to because of health reasons. This is what's going to generate the explosion of peasant jobs. Now, in the third world, I saw this all over the third world when I was traveling. For example, watching a house get built or any sort of a structure get built. This one was using bricks, and it was about the size of an Australian sort of suburban 3-bedroom type house. And there must have been 100 people plus doing the bricklaying. So they weren't using things. There were no tools. There were no wheelbarrows. There was no proper tools. Everything was human labor. So they had this, and it was done. I mean, you couldn't imagine something less efficient if you tried. But they had this human chain where the truck had pulled up and the bricks were on it, and the truck was parked, I thought, way too far away from where the work was. But anyway, and then they just formed this human chain. But it wasn't people passing to each other. They were actually standing shoulder. The shoulders were touching and bunched up, touching. So they would pass a brick to one another down this human chain. I mean, it took like a half an hour to get the brick from one end to the other. And then there'd be the bricklayer there'd be a guy would hold the brick, another guy would put the cement on it, another guy would put the brick down, another guy. It was inefficiency on steroids. But all these people, they're all gaggling away in their local dialect and with much excitement and so and so on. But these are the sort of this is how work's done in the third world, where you've got this huge surplus of labour, and in order to give people something to do, the efficiency and the productivity must be forced downwards quite aggressively. So, and I think that's what it is happening. If you look at the takeout food show, the amount of midget Asians running around Sydney, for example, and the amount of them that work in these takeout food stores and so on, food shops, cafes and the like, there's vastly more people than you actually need. So what do? And the only way you can make that work is through an inefficient business process and paying people absolute shit money. And that's very much the direction that we're heading in. And the explosion of jobs that the West has supposedly produced to absorb all these mass migration peasants, the explosion of jobs has all been in very low productivity service type industries that are suited only for illiterate peasants and pay pennies. And that's where we're going. And that's where the mass migration fits in. You've been fantastic today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.